Hi, I am Dr. Rachel Kowert. I am honored to be here today giving the keynote lecture for the Game Studies Pre-Conference of NCA 2020. It's been quite a wild ride, and I am looking forward to taking a look back at how games, and specifically the communication and discourse around games, has changed in these after times, in these post-COVID-19 times that we're experiencing here in 2020. Now, before I begin, I'd like to introduce myself to those who may not know me or my work. As I said, my name is Dr. Rachel Kowert. I am a research psychologist, and I am the research director of Take This, which is a mental health nonprofit, the first mental health nonprofit to form specifically to serve gaming communities in the gaming industry. Our mission at Take This is to destigmatize mental health challenges and provide mental health information and resources. I am also a science content creator, Zeitgeist. I post new videos every week on YouTube where I talk about the science of games. So, digital games in the after times. In the months since the COVID-19 pandemic began, the general discourse about video games in the public and the media seems to have shifted in relation to the uses and effects of games, particularly in relation to their social utility. So what I want to talk about today is, has COVID-19 been the impetus that we needed to shift the narratives about video games away from them as being tools for destruction and towards tools for connection? There have been several shifts in and around games since the COVID-19 lockdowns began in March 2020 in North America. The first worth mentioning is the increase in the number of people playing games. In August 2020, gaming sales in the US had seen a 37% increase from the same time in 2019 to $3.3 billion. As of March 2020, 76% of US homes had at least one internet-connected device. And I'm sure, as you know, once the pandemic started, there was a rush to buy gaming consoles for anyone who didn't yet have one, the remaining 24%. Because if you were trying to get a Switch or a Ring Fit Adventure, it was pretty much impossible. Nielsen found that 82% of the people that they surveyed reported playing video games during the COVID-19 pandemic. Video Game Tracking reported that the number of people who said they were playing games now due to the COVID-19 pandemic increased 46% in the US, 41% in France, 28% in the UK, and 23% in Germany. So there's really been a global increase in the number of people playing games since the COVID-19 pandemic began. There's not only been a shift in people playing games, but also how gaming content is consumed through streaming. A report from the Nielsen Company found Twitch engagement more than doubled between January 2020 and March 2020, from 13 million hours watched to 31 million hours watched. Another report from Twitch itself in May reported a 45% increase in viewership between March and April, and it's up more than 60% over the same 3 months in 2019. In the first quarter of 2020, as compared to the second quarter of 2020, Twitch saw a 56% growth in hours watched, with it peaking at 1.8 billion hours. Billion with a B. And this is just Twitch. Facebook gaming, which yes, apparently is still a thing, reported 75% growth from quarter 1 to quarter 2 of 2020, with hours peaking at 342 million. So while Twitch is still the undisputed leader here, Facebook gaming has staked out a large chunk of the market. There seems to be enough to go around. Now, I guess it only makes sense with the increase in the amount of streaming that's being consumed. There's also been an increase in amount of the people who are streaming. Here's an article from the Wall Street Journal talking about how everyone is a streamer in 2020. And I won't lie, even I dabbled in it. Perhaps what's most interesting about the growth in streaming is the growth in what kinds of content is being streamed. The just chatting category of streaming content, which can range from anything from a talk show to just a one-man show, increased the most of all of the Twitch categories at 6%. Twitch reports 176 million hours of just chatting content was watched in July 2020 as compared to only 80 million hours a few months previously in December 2019. For me, I've particularly enjoyed the chatting shows that have grown in and around games. Things like Dungeon Crossing and Animal Talking. If you're not familiar with these two programs, Dungeon Crossing is hosted by Tanya DePass, also known as Cypher of Tyr on Twitch, and it's where she DMs a D&D game in the basement of her Animal Crossing home. Similar Animal Talking is a talk show hosted by Gary Whitta, where he has celebrities come to hit the basement of his Animal Crossing home, people like T-Pain and Brie Larson, and you can literally hear the delight in their voices when they come into his house and they appear on these shows. It's really a wonderful mix of games and chat and play. Well, I haven't seen any research explaining why there's been an increase specifically in the just chatting categories. I would hypothesize that it's at least partially linked to the increase in loneliness that people are generally experiencing since the initiation of social distancing. But more on that later. Now, beyond the increase in players and the increase in streamers, the biggest change we've seen in the after times, the most notable change for me and probably for you as communication scholars, has been the change in news coverage. Here are just a few examples of the way that games are being covered now in the after times. As compared to how games were covered in the before times. Now, I'm sure some of this shift is due to increase in consumption. I mean, overnight, video games did basically become the last interactive experience we could have with our friends at a safe distance of 6 feet apart from each other. And I mean, some people, some smart people, have gone so far to say that games have been the saving grace of COVID-19. And no, I'm not the only one who said it. And a lot of this discourse and all of a sudden overnight love for video games really does seem to have been targeted to one game in particular, a game that I've already mentioned a couple of times. Of course, I'm talking about Animal Crossing. We cannot talk about games in the after times, games in 2020, without talking about the game of the pandemic. So much Animal Crossing. I myself have been talking to the press for more than 10 years, and I've never done more interviews about any game than I have Animal Crossing, and I was working during the height of World of Warcraft and several Grand Theft Auto releases. Take this for example, Animal Crossing is getting me through the quarantine and I'm not alone. Animal Crossing New Horizons became a form of virtual escape for me and many others amid the chaos of the coronavirus pandemic. This is a positive framing of escapism, which is absolutely astonishing, as researchers generally note that escapism is often framed as a negative motivation to play games, particularly in relation to the way that it's framed when we talk about things like reading a good book, escaping into a good book, or escaping into a television show. For more on that, I highly recommend this paper by Wormlink and colleagues. Animal Crossing has even been getting positive news coverage from news outlets that you wouldn't really expect to be writing positive stories about games. Good Housekeeping and Women's Day, they've all posted similar articles. Another notable thing about this change is the focus on playing together. I can't think of another single time in history in which playing together video games as a family was discussed by major news outlets. I can honestly say I never expected to see articles come out of these outlets about how to get your family into video games. The sheer amount of media coverage that Animal Crossing has received since March is staggering. And as I mentioned, most of these articles are centered around either its sheer popularity or it highlights its practical utility during a period of high stress and uncertainty, like during the COVID-19 pandemic, its ability to socially connect players, and its ability to release stress. Animal Crossing also seems to have bridged an intergenerational gap between parents and adults with video games, which is something I don't think I've ever seen before. Animal Crossing has become such a phenomenon that the academics have also jumped on board. For example, the journal Loading announced they're going to be featuring an entire series of papers about Animal Crossing, which may be out by now. That might be worth Googling. So in the after times, we've seen shifts with the number of people playing, shifts in streaming and its popularity and the amount of content that's being created. We've seen a shift in the communication from news media in and around games, and these are all significant and worthy of an extended discussion. But this last point, the shift in discourse, the shift in communication, is what I want to focus on, because for me, this has been the most drastic and the most significant. As game studies scholars, we have been fighting the moral panic in and around games for 50 years. 50, half a century. Wait, I feel like I've talked about this before. Hello and welcome to Zeitgeist, where we talk about the psychology of the era, the science of games. I am your host, Dr. Rachel Kowert, and on today's episode of Academic Ramblings, we're going to be tackling the moral panic. Moral panic is likely a term that you've heard before. It comes with a lot of history and a lot of misunderstanding. Moral panics are irrational approaches to observable and quantifiable phenomena that can be understood separate from subjective evaluation. So they are irrational approaches because at their core, they're about ascribing an easy solution to a complex problem. That can best be understood as separate from subjective evaluations refers to the fact that ascribing an easy solution doesn't allow for you to take the time to understand the issue from a more subjective evaluation. For example, the cycle of video games being blamed after literally every mass shooting. Columbine, Aurora, Virginia Tech, Marjory Stoneman Douglas. After every single one of these shootings, there were multiple reports about how the shooter played video games. Why? Because when something bad happens, they're an easy scapegoat. This is despite the fact that science paints a far more nuanced picture when talking about the way in which media impacts our behavior, or doesn't impact our behavior. Moral panics are a problem because they deflect resources away from determining the real underlying causes of any particular problem. For instance, looking at peer delinquency as a contributing factor to violent crime among youths rather than violent video game play. Put another way, moral panics are a problem because they diminish the role of the individual as an active creator of meaning. It implies that we are just vessels for media messages that works in a very I see, I do kind of way, with no consideration for individual factors that may be filtering the meaning. Which, even at face value, we can see how this is an erroneous assumption, because what one person finds violent, another person doesn't. And what one person finds inspiring, another person doesn't. And what one person finds to be the best movie of all time, well, everyone else who doesn't is wrong. But why has the moral panic lingered for so long? The moral panic about games may have started in the 1970s, but they remain perpetuated today by a combination of sensationalized news media and their misrepresentation in pop culture. It is important to understand the factors that drive moral panics around video games so we can understand why they continue to be viewed as tools for destruction, why they continue to be viewed as having a negative influence on society, and why they continue to be viewed as a potentially dangerous activity. The first is sensationalized news media, with reports exaggerating or sometimes outright fabricating the potential negative consequences that games can have on its players. The other issue is the representation of games and gamers in pop culture. A prime example of the stereotypes of gamers comes from an episode of South Park called Make Love Not Warcraft. In it, the four main characters of the series begin to play World of Warcraft. And over the episode, they slowly descend into becoming more overweight, more socially inept, and more socially reclusive. They also start to be trolled by this guy, who is another great epitome of the stereotype of online gamers. He's overweight, his house is unkempt, you can see he's got something on his wrist like he has a gaming injury. There's a knife on his desk, perhaps that's an allusion to violent video games and violent behavior. The combination of sensationalized news media and the negative portrayal of games and gamers in pop culture perpetuates the moral panic around the uses and effects of games. This is particularly evident today when we have 10 plus years of research in the field that have debunked many of the claims fueled by this moral panic, such as the relationship between violent video games and violent behavior, the links to negative social outcomes, and the fact that gamers do not in fact fit this mold. I'm not sure anyone fits that mold. That mold is what nightmares are made of. Sorry, that last image can now be seared into your brains too. So we've had 50 years of that. And now since March, we have these headlines. We have obsession being framed as a positive thing and the encouragement of the whole family to play. We have video games being discussed as a family-friendly activity. And we have the positive framing of escapism mentioned earlier. We have seen a 360-degree shift in the way games are discussed and framed, and they're even being encouraged by parents to give to their children. This shift, I believe, has been driven at least a little bit by the increase in people consuming games since March, the increase in players, the increase in streaming. But to be honest, the industry itself has been growing year after year. At the end of the day, I think a lot of the credit goes to Animal Crossing. As I mentioned, Animal Crossing has been the game of the pandemic. I want to take a bit of time to explore why. What is it about this game, its unique characteristics, and fortuitously timed release that has pushed forward the narrative about video games, their uses, and potential positive effects, 50 years? In my opinion, Animal Crossing has been one of the primary reasons we have seen this shift in communication in and around games in the after times, which as game studies scholars, we have all been patiently awaiting for games to have their time in the positive spotlight when it comes to media coverage. In case you've been living under a rock, here's a little 411 on Animal Crossing. Animal Crossing is a game by Nintendo made for the Nintendo Switch. It centers around your character moving to a deserted island, building a house, building a village populated by cute animal neighbors. You can play with your friends, they can visit your village, or you can visit their village. You earn bells, which is the in-game currency. You can go fishing, you can curate a museum, you can buy things at the local corner store. Over time, as you earn more bells, you can upgrade your house and make it bigger. You can customize your furniture. You can get coordinated furniture sets. You can grow and decorate your town. The game is cute and colorful, and it doesn't require any special skills to complete. It's truly delightful in every sense of the word. And for a whole lot of us, myself included, it has been the game of the pandemic. So what is it that makes Animal Crossing so special that it could almost single-handedly change the discourse we've been having about video games for half a century? To understand that, we need to take a step back and start with the basics and talk about play. A lot of times, I think as game studies scholars, we take for granted that at its root, video games at their most rudimentary level are about play. Play is foundational. As humans, we've been playing since the beginning of time. In old ruined cities, you inevitably find dice and cards. Play is important throughout our lifespan, not just in childhood, as many people assume. It is critical to our mental well-being and happiness. It can boost our creativity. It can reduce anxiety and depression, which is always critical, but especially so now that COVID-19 has brought upon a mental health crisis. So games are important throughout the lifespan. They're associated with broad positive outcomes like happiness, reduced stress, reduced anxiety, and increased creativity. But why? What is happening when we engage in these digital, playful spaces that leads to these positive outcomes? And what is it about Animal Crossing specifically? Well, if we want to start at the very bottom, on a neurochemical level, play is associated with the release of endorphins. As discussed here, quote, every time you play, your body releases chemicals known as endorphins that interact with pleasure and pain receptors in your brain. Endorphins can make you feel more positive and energize your outlook, improve immune responses, and reduce stress. A more communication-based explanation would lean towards discussing how play has a strong influence on our well-being because of the role it plays in mood management and repair. Mood management and mood repair strategies refer to techniques that a person can take to shift their mood from a negative mood or a positive mood, from sadness to happiness, or from high stress to low stress. Research has found entertainment media to be an effective vehicle for mood management, to bring negative emotions and mood back into balance. For example, research has found that bored individuals tend to watch exciting television programs, whereas stressed individuals prefer to watch relaxing television programs. Or you just watch The Witcher no matter what your mood because The Witcher. Broadly speaking, games are particularly effective tools for mood management because good games, well-designed games, engage players that help us meet our basic psychological needs as humans. They give us a sense of autonomy. We're free to make our own choices. They give us a sense of competence. We can achieve things, we can feel success, and they give us a sense of relatedness, of connecting with others. These three components, autonomy, competence, and relatedness, are thought to be universal and essential for psychological health and well-being. Having these needs met while also having the added element of playfulness makes you feel good and happy and satisfied. This idea is called self-determination theory, which is a theory of motivation from the 1970s, but has been expanded to specifically talk about games and how well-designed games can contribute to our well-being, a sense of happiness, and a sense of satisfaction. Animal Crossing ticks all these boxes. It is a well-designed game that satisfies the needs of self-determination theory. We feel a sense of autonomy because things can go at our own pace. We feel a sense of competence when we accomplish the mundane tasks of gardening our flower beds or fishing. Our relatedness needs can be met by playing together with family and friends, and also through the relationships we have with our cute animal villagers. The reason this is so important now, to have a game that so beautifully ticks all of these boxes of basic human motivation, is because these three needs, these three things, competence, autonomy, and relatedness, are all hindered due to COVID-19. We do not have a sense of autonomy. We are not free to go where we want to go. We are not free to do it without a mask. Wear your mask. Our sense of competence is reduced. We can't really control the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic. I mean, we wear our masks and we stay inside and we social distance and do all of those things. But generally speaking, we cannot control its spread globally. We're also likely feeling less competent at our jobs as we now work from home and perhaps are also full-time homeschoolers and also full-time living with our now working from home spouses, which is adjustment. Our relatedness needs are reduced as well with increased social distancing, social bubbles, and all the other things that have come along with the COVID-19 pandemic. This idea that games are supplementing a loss of these feelings of competence, autonomy, and relatedness are being supported by initial research coming out of the University of York. Sebastian Dietrich has done some qualitative work in and around COVID-19, asking players what games they are playing during COVID-19 and why. And consistently, these three themes arise. Players report that they feel that games are providing them a sense of autonomy, competence, and control when their options of getting it elsewhere are limited. The relatedness component is particularly key, not only in terms of game enjoyment and motivation, but also in relation to the aftertimes itself. It's likely why we've seen an increase in streaming for the social community, the increase in the just chatting category of streaming, but also the increase in game playing, because games provide us unique social affordances that other forms, say from 6 feet away, of entertainment cannot. Play is a great way to foster social relationships. It's an icebreaker. It provides an activity to do together, which can become the focus of conversation, reducing pressure to think about things like 2020 is a nightmare. For example, in the research at the University of York that I mentioned earlier, a lot of people mentioned they are playing Tabletop Simulator. I myself also started a Tabletop Simulator campaign, a Gloomhaven campaign with my brother that I play every Saturday. Now for me, I could call my brother and talk to him for 15 minutes about his day, or I can sit down with him for an hour and a half every Saturday and slay monsters. And then we can talk about how selfish he is because he never heals me. Games connected online, like my Gloomhaven campaign, or like Animal Crossing, are uniquely different from connecting socially online through an online forum or social media because of their interactivity. They provide us with a way to actively engage and have shared experiences, which is notable at a time when we remain physically distanced and are less able to have traditional shared experiences like dinner parties. In and of itself, socialization is a key component to our well-being, and one of the key reasons for that is that it reduces our sense of loneliness, which has a range of negative effects on our physical and mental health, including increased stress and depression. In fact, research has found that loneliness and social isolation is twice as harmful to a person's physical and mental health than obesity. We know that shared experiences can provide a buffer for these negative effects of loneliness and lead to increased self-esteem, decreased feelings of depression and anxiety, decreased sense of isolation, and an increased sense of belonging. Now, we've already noted that Animal Crossing excels in the playful department, but in the social department, they are doubly successful. Remember those animal neighbors I was talking about? Animal Crossing not only allows us to connect with other people, but these cute animal neighbors serve the incredibly valuable function of fostering what we call parasocial relationships, a term that many of you are likely familiar with, but for those who are not, parasocial relationships is a term developed in the 1950s to describe the relationships we feel with TV personalities. It explains why if I saw Jimmy Fallon on the street, I would have the sense that I actually know him, but that feeling is not mutual because he doesn't know me. I mean, I actually don't know him, but I feel like I do because I see him on TV every night. Now, when I bring up the term parasocial relationships, I cannot leave the discussion without talking about one of my favorite research studies of the last decade. Dr. Daniel and Westerman did a study where they looked at the sentiments expressed by people via tweets after the death of Jon Snow in Game of Thrones. Sorry if that was a spoiler, but you are way late to the game. What they found was the sentiments expressed in the tweets followed the same stages of grief that people express when a close family or friend dies. So taking it back to Animal Crossing, when you have fellow villagers to talk to and you're rewarded for doing so, when they are happy to see us, when they notice we've been missing, and when they send us random letters and gifts in the mail, that sense of connectedness and camaraderie and empathy and compassion, whatever it might be, is very much real. So another key point about Animal Crossing is intergenerational gaming, which I briefly mentioned earlier. Games are not something that have traditionally been played intergenerationally. I can remember my parents very much not playing games with me when I was a kid. As we got older, my parents may have had more interest in trying out some of the games we were playing, but the barrier to entry can be quite high for something like a Final Fantasy. Enter Animal Crossing, which is a casual game by definition. It requires no special skills. You can play for 5 minutes or you can play for 5 hours. You can make it as simple as you want just by picking and selling fruit at the local store, or you can make it as complicated as you want by playing the stock market. This has opened the door for intergenerational play. One more thing to mention here about Animal Crossing is the nostalgia factor. It is possible that a lot of parents of little ones played the original Animal Crossing, so returning back to this game can provide a sense of returning to our rose-colored glasses of the before times. Nostalgia is a really interesting thing to discuss when it comes to video games, and there has been some discussion about a lot of people are returning to the games of their past during COVID-19. The work by Sebastian Dieterding that I mentioned earlier from the University of York, he also found that his players reported a lot of old games that they were playing. Minecraft, Baldur's Gate 2, and old Final Fantasies. And unlike our parents of this generation, a whole lot of them anyway, did grow up with video games. So they don't have to push through that technology gap that may have hindered the parents of before. So did Animal Crossing save our souls? I mean, I did do a PAX Online panel with that exact title with Sebastian. So if you're interested in that work I keep referring to, it's not yet published. You can watch that video and he talks a lot about his findings there. So maybe Animal Crossing didn't really save our souls, but it absolutely has significantly changed our communication and discourse in and around games in the after times. And yes, I do think Animal Crossing deserves all of the credit I'm giving it here. Because as I mentioned before, we've been studying games for 50 years. And those 50 years are filled with examples of moral panic, games make you violent, and gaming addiction. So what did Animal Crossing do right? It's accessible. It's cute and colorful. It's everything that parents and journalists and pundits want video games to be. It's the perfect vehicle to open up the broader discussions about how games socially connect others. And it was released at just the right time. So I'm going to hop off the Animal Crossing train for just a minute because I also want to note how the conversation has changed around video game addiction specifically in the after times. The best way to summarize pre versus post-COVID discourse on games is looking at these two images. On the left is the before times. On the right is the after times. Same publication, same author. As many of you likely know, the World Health Organization has been the driving force for video game addiction categorization and classification, despite a whole bunch of pushback from scholars in the field. In August 2019, we have this before COVID article. In March 2020, we have this after COVID article. I honestly don't think I've come across a single story in the after times about video game addiction. Honestly, it's to the point where people are asking, is video game addiction even still a thing? While I don't think the backpedaling by the WHO was driven by Animal Crossing, or at least very unlikely because it had just been released, I do believe that the reception of Animal Crossing by parents and families and the media is the primary driving force as to why these discussions haven't come up. As we saw earlier, we saw the news story saying everyone is obsessed, and they said it in a positive way. Animal Crossing was the perfect game, released at the perfect time, to open up broader communications, broader discussions about how games can be positive, about how games can socially connect us, about how games are fun activities that we can all enjoy without a looming fear of addiction and aggression and becoming an antisocial recluse like these guys. We remember these guys. So digital games in the after times. We are finally seeing nuanced discussions highlighting video games' potential to be tools for positive change. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying there are no negative consequences to gameplay. Of course, some people can use games maladaptively and have negative repercussions in their life. But for the vast majority of people, this is not the case, despite the fact it is what has dominated communication in and around games since their inception. We know as game study scholars that games can be tools for stress relief, for creativity, for team building, for socializing, and for fun. Because at the end of the day, that is what they were made for. When did fun not become an important outcome? Now, here's to hoping this line of dialogue continues post-pandemic, because I think that the pandemic, as awful and terrible and horrible as it is, one thing to come out of it that's been positive, besides people keeping 6 foot away from me at Costco, because I do like that, it's been this shift in the public discourse in and around games. The media is long overdue to adopt this narrative that is less moral panic and more scientific truth, that video games are fantastic tools for fun, for stress reduction, and for social connection. Thank you all so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this talk about video games in the after times and have found a newfound appreciation for the gem that is Animal Crossing. Here are some ways that you can get in contact with me if you have any questions or you want to chat more. I wish we were talking over pastries and coffee or getting lunch, but you know, 2020. Again, thank you very much for having me, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your NCA 2020.